Hey friends, I thought I'd start off this video by paying homage to the man who inspired tonight's video. David Paulides is a former police officer turned investigator journalist who penned the series of books entitled Missing 411. They're awesome books, and I strongly recommend you head over to his site to purchase them, as they've served as the inspiration for many cryptozoologists and paranormal investigators. Some of tonight's stories are not included in any of Mr. Paulides' books, but in using the title Missing 411, I wish to pay respects to the man, not piggyback off his ideas or detract from all of his hard work. So, if you find tonight's subject matter interesting, be sure to head over to his YouTube channel entitled Can-Nam Missing Project. Thank you, Mr. Paulides, for being a continuing source of inspiration and for being a source of hope to the families of the disappeared. On Friday, September 6th of 1997, 73-year-old John Devine decided to hike into Washington's Olympic National Park for a weekend's camping. The Reverend Michael Casting, John's pastor at his hometown of Squim, described him as a quiet man, good-natured and cheerful, who has a great love for the mountains. Despite his advanced age and the fact that he was legally blind in one eye, John was an experienced outdoorsman and did indeed love the mountains. He was also in impeccable physical shape for a man in his 70s and supplemented a healthy diet with daily exercises to ensure full mobility even at such an advanced age. One of John's rare hiking partners, Greg Balzer, said John often preferred to hike alone, as even younger folk struggle to match his pace. He walks very fast, he said. Sometimes even I can't keep up with him. According to John's loved ones, he had mentioned wanting to climb all 7,000 feet of Mount Baldy, using a tough, rugged mountain pathway known as the Maynard Burn Trail. Even more youthful hikers would have found this a challenge, but John had spent a great deal of time hiking around the park, and it was believed that he'd reached the summit of Mount Baldy with relatively little difficulty. John was last spotted on the afternoon of September 7th while hiking along Grey Wolf Ridge on the park's north side. He had been camping with a friend just outside the park's boundary in the Buckhorn Wilderness area of Olympic National Forest, and after setting off for Mount Baldy in the early morning, John assured his friend that he would return by the late afternoon. However, as the sun set on September 7th and John had failed to reappear at his campsite, his friend began to worry. The following morning, when John had still not returned from his hike, his friend was concerned enough to contact John's family, who swiftly reported him missing to local authorities. A dozen search and rescue personnel began to comb the area of Mueller Creek, a region believed to be John's last known whereabouts. But as darkness began to fall and no traces of John had been uncovered, the first day's search was called off. 23-year-old Jason Berry, who had been a Park Service volunteer for 2 years at that point, told local media outlets that the terrain was steep and rugged, with bushes that were so thick that it's tough to walk down the drainages. Sergeant Don Kelly of the Clallam County Sheriff's Office, who helped coordinate the search with the National Park Service, was quoted as saying, "If he was walking around up there, we would have found him by now. Same if he had fallen down and hurt himself. Although if that were the case, there's a chance that we're not going to find him alive." After park rangers conducted an initial search of the park and failed to discover any trace of the missing John, more expensive assets were co-opted to aid in the search. One of these assets was a Bell 205A1 rescue helicopter, piloted by 35-year-old Kevin Johnston of Springfield, Oregon. He was joined by 52-year-old Rita McMahon, a search volunteer who trained dogs to help with rescue missions, and 31-year-old Taryn Hoover, a seasonal park employee who could help Kevin navigate the proposed search areas. On one flight, they were joined by a trio of other passengers and took off from the mountainside before flying up to the 5,000-foot level of Mount Baldy. Then, about halfway through the proposed flight path, the helicopter's pilot thought he'd spotted someone walking through a snowdrift who fit their missing person's description. Those in radio contact with the helicopter and its pilot noted that after spotting the person they believed to be John Devine, the crew attempted to gain their attention while flying a little lower to the mountainside. Then suddenly, the pilot somehow lost control of the aircraft and the helicopter went careening into the mountainside. The crash killed 3 crew members and severely injured the remainder, who were rushed to the Olympic Memorial Hospital in nearby Port Angeles. Once they were lucid enough to be questioned in relation to the crash, the survivors had chilling stories to tell. One claimed that after gaining the attention of the person on the ground, the helicopter was suddenly struck by something which sent it into a tailspin and caused it to crash. Another survivor claimed that it was a freak gust of wind that downed the chopper, but the fact remains that the only 2 people who really knew what caused the crash had been killed when the aircraft smashed into the mountainside. There were no prior reports of mechanical troubles with the helicopter, and the crash was such a mystery that a National Transportation Safety Board investigator and representatives of Bell Helicopters, Helijet, and the engine manufacturer were sent to the crash site. To this day, the exact cause of the crash has never been fully established, and with the only real clue being the unintelligible screams of terror that preceded it, it's unlikely that we'll ever know what the true cause was. At the request of his loved ones, the larger search effort was suspended just a week after John's disappearance. They were still reeling from the news of the helicopter crash deaths and argued that John would be devastated that lives had been lost in the search for him. He wouldn't want these people putting themselves at risk for him, said a close neighbor of his. He would have said, "Back off, I know that." But in spite of the wishes of his family and friends, Olympic National Park personnel promised to continue looking for John through routine patrols of the Mount Baldy area. The case isn't closed until Mr. Devine is found, park spokeswoman Barb Main said. But it was the consensus of the search team that with bad weather setting in and 6 days without even a clue as to where he might be, the chances for survival are really quite slim. Sadly, John Devine was never found, and he was declared legally deceased just a few years ago. But disturbingly, he wasn't the only experienced hiker to become lost in the Olympic National Park that year. Back in June, 21-year-old Port Angeles resident Chris Wursler became lost while on his first solo overnight backpacking trip. A lot was made of the fact that it was his first solo trip, as it implied that Chris was an inexperienced amateur. However, Chris had been on many backpacking trips prior to getting lost, and was by no means incapable of fieldcraft and navigation. He entered the park in early June and was expected to return home on the evening of June 6th, but it took Chris almost 2 weeks to re-emerge from the woods. Just like John Devine, an extensive search effort had failed to pinpoint his location, and following his re-emergence, search and rescue teams were very interested to know exactly where he'd been. Yet when Chris was asked to describe how he'd gotten lost, he had few memories of his time in the park and described feeling disoriented for several days. He only seemed to remember his first and final few hours in the park, and had somehow survived for almost 2 weeks on a small amount of food and water. Whatever happened to Chris might well be to blame for John Devine's disappearance too, as aside from a freak accident, there aren't many other explanations for why such an experienced and hardy hiker might disappear. In the aftermath of John's disappearance, a wave of shock and grief crashed over his family, friends, and neighbors. "It's like lights have gone out in the neighborhood," said one person who knew him. But as the grief passed, questions remained. Who or what took John Devine that day? And could it be responsible for the many other disappearances that have occurred in our nation's national parks? In July of 1971, 8-year-old Douglas Legg joined his family on a trip to New York's Adirondack Mountains. The Leggs had booked themselves a vacation at the Santanoni Estate, a large summer resort frequented by the state's more affluent occupants. The 12,500-acre estate featured around 40 large guest cabins, along with a 24-room main lodge that boasted 5-star drinking and dining facilities. The seamless blend of contemporary luxury and verdant wilderness made Santanoni incredibly popular, and securing a midsummer booking was no small feat. But the legs trip was made extra special by the fact that Santanoni was soon to be closed to the public following an impending sale, meaning they would be one of the last few families to enjoy the estate's rustic opulence before its closure. It should have been the vacation of a lifetime, something the Legs would look back on with fondness for years to come. Instead, the trip was one that would haunt young Douglas's parents for the rest of their natural lives. On the afternoon of July 10th, Douglas joined one of his uncles on what was intended to be a brief, leisurely hike through the woods. It was an exceptionally warm day, even for July, and Douglas had opted to wear shorts to keep himself cooler. But as he and his uncle took their first few steps into the forest, they spotted numerous patches of poison ivy sprouting from the overgrowth. At around 3:30 p.m., Douglas's uncle told him to run back to the cabin and change into a pair of long pants, the thick fabric of which would protect his legs from stinging oils of the poison ivy. The cabin was only a short walk from where they were standing, a few hundred meters at the most, and as the uncle watched Douglas disappear back down the trail, he expected his return in mere minutes. Yet little Douglas did not reappear, and with each passing minute, his uncle became more and more concerned. Eventually, Douglas's uncle became so agitated that he too traced his steps along the trail, walking all the way back to the guest cabin that they were staying in. It was there that the uncle bumped into Douglas's older brother, who told him that the boy wasn't changing his shorts in the cabin, as he was supposed to be doing, but was instead wandering around the estate's main lodge. Irritated, but assuaged nonetheless, the uncle then wandered over to Santanoni's main lodge to look for Douglas. Unable to find him there either, the uncle asked one of Douglas's cousins if he'd spotted the young boy tottering around. His cousin had seen him, not around the main lodge, but near a steep ridge about a minute or two's walk from the main lodge. Douglas's uncle once again marched off to search for him, but after walking back and forth along the ridgeline a number of times, he was unable to find him. At that point, Douglas's uncle raised the alarm, informing the boy's parents that he couldn't be found. His parents then rushed to inform the estate's general manager, who ordered a number of his staff to aid the Legg family in their search for young Douglas. But despite scouring almost every inch of estate until nightfall, calling out the poor boy's name as they went, not a single person was able to find hide nor hair of young Douglas. Only then were the police alerted, and what followed would be one of the largest search and rescues the state of New York had ever seen. Over the course of the following week, the search team was bolstered by park rangers, tracker dogs, a mountain rescue team, helicopters equipped with infrared cameras, and 1,000 volunteer rescue personnel from around the country. It was a veritable army, but it was one that was hampered by rough terrain, bad weather, and poor organization. At one point during the search and rescue effort, a bloodhound picked up the boy's scent and then took its handlers through almost 30 miles of dense, hilly forest. The scent trail seemed to end at a small pond, one which was thoroughly searched for any sign of young Douglas. Thankfully, no human remains were discovered from the pond, but that was cold comfort for the search and rescue team, who were faced with a rather terrifying prospect. It was extremely unlikely that a child as young as Douglas had the stamina to navigate the path that his scent trail was on. Therefore, it stood to reason that he had been carried or even dragged by someone considerably stronger. If this was the case, Douglas hadn't just wandered off. He'd been kidnapped. Not only that, but since the scent trail ended at a small pond, tracking experts believed that Douglas's kidnapper had taken the time to thoroughly wash him down before moving on. Washing the boy down in the pond would have obscured his scent trail, making it impossible for the dogs to continue tracking him. If Douglas's kidnapper knew this and the act was deliberate, it meant the authorities weren't just dealing with some unhinged maniac. They were hunting a cold, calculated predator who had the skills to make his victims disappear. The search continued for 6 long weeks, with volunteers and professionals alike scouring vast portions of the Adirondack Mountains but not a trace of 8-year-old Douglas could be found. It was a search that was as exhausting as it was confounding, with many of the professional search and rescue personnel voicing their frustrations with the fruitless result. It was almost like Douglas and his kidnapper had dropped off the face of the earth once they'd reached that small woodland pond. The lack of witnesses back at the Santanoni estate was another vexing issue for law enforcement. Aside from Douglas's brother and cousin, no one remembered seeing a little boy wandering around at all, let alone did they see one being dragged off into the woods. For the Legg family, the pain and torment of that period was almost unbearable. His parents later said that sometimes they felt like they were so close to finding Douglas, only to have that feeling snatched away from them time and time again. That cycle of dashed hopes would continue for years on end, with the Legg family launching public appeals for information on multiple occasions, but it would take more than 20 years for the first serious developments to occur. In 1993, a woman approached by the New York State Police informed them that her relative had murdered little Douglas before dumping his body in a Lewis County lake. The woman was then interviewed for a considerable amount of time, and when she was shown a map of the area surrounding the Santanoni estate, she was able to point to the exact lake where Douglas was said to have been disposed of. This lake was then dragged and examined by specially trained divers, but not a trace of human remains could be found. It was later discovered that the woman was a former psychiatric patient, one that just so happened to be suffering from some variety of false memory syndrome, and despite putting a great deal of faith into her statements, the Legg family were forced to disregard them. But that same year, a man from Montana came forward with some far more reliable information. He claimed that back in 1973 he had been illegally hunting up near the Santanoni estate and had stumbled across some skeletal remains that could have easily been those of a child. He was unfamiliar with the story of Douglas's disappearance, but as much as he wanted to report what he'd seen, he couldn't risk being arrested and fired if the police discovered he'd been poaching. Years later, he was overwhelmed with guilt after hearing of Douglas's disappearance, and wanted to help so bad that he was willing to risk his livelihood to do so. The authorities quickly followed up on the man's claims, combing over the exact area that he'd been hunting, but again, not a trace of Douglas's remains were ever found. However, that didn't mean the hunter's claims were false, as over the course of 20-plus years, it's entirely possible that any remains would have been eaten, carried off by scavengers, or buried under the topsoil of an area too large to dig up. The most recent lead in the case came in the year 2020, when members of the New York State Police Underwater Recovery Team were training at a lake near the Santanoni estate. A diver was examining the bottom of the lake, practicing techniques he'd employed for real if he was ever tasked with recovering human remains from a body of water, and suddenly, he felt something small, tough, and dense beneath his fingertips. He picked it up, cleared away some of the dirt, then discovered it was some sort of bone fragment. This once again raised the hopes of the Legg family, who were informed that the bone fragment, later determined to be a piece of skull, might well belong to Douglas. However, after a thorough analysis, it was determined to have belonged to an animal and not a person. Following the discovery of the bone fragment, there had been no other plausible leads in 8-year-old Douglas's disappearance, and while the case remains open, it's about as cold as it's possible to get. Meanwhile, whatever or whoever was responsible for the boy's disappearance is still out there, and it might just be only a matter of time before they claim another victim. In the snowy mountainous wilderness of Canada's far northwest lies the Nahanni National Park Reserve. Established in 1972, the reserve consists of 11,600 square miles of wild rivers, canyons, and waterfalls, a place of such natural beauty that it was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site just 6 years after it was founded. Yet the park's spectacular views and unmatched serenity mask a dark and sinister past, one filled with tribal warfare, mysterious disappearances, and gruesome murder. The Dene First Nations peoples have inhabited the lands around Nahanni National Park Reserve for thousands of years. According to their oral history, the Dene were once locked into a bitter and bloody struggle with a neighboring tribe known as the Naha. The Naha made their homes in the foothills of what are now known as the Mackenzie Mountains, while the Dene dwelled on the valley floors below. This made the Dene particularly susceptible to Naha's lightning-fast raiding techniques, while their own uphill counterattacks proved bloody and futile affairs. If the Dene wished to live in peace, they had to strike back at the Naha with such viciousness that they would be forever driven from their mountain homes. But since the Naha warriors vastly outnumbered their own, the Dene would have to execute an effective and decisive ambush, one that would deliver a knockout blow and end the many years of costly conflict. Before they struck, the Dene waited for a new moon, ensuring their attack took place on the darkest night of the month. Then, while creeping up the pitch-black hillsides, the Dene planned to silently pounce on any Naha patrols they came across, cutting their enemies' throats to ensure none of them could raise the alarm. But curiously, even as they got within arrow shot of the main Naha encampment, not a single enemy warrior could be seen. Silence greeted Dene warriors as they reached the perimeter of the enemy camp, and for a moment, it seemed as if though they'd caught their tormentors completely unaware. Yet as they stormed the Naha teepees, tomahawks primed to taste the blood of their foes, they realized the camp was completely deserted. There were food stocks still remaining in the camp, fires still smoldering away, but there were no Naha tribesmen to be seen. It was as if life at the camp had just suddenly and inexplicably stopped. The incident so terrified the warband that the story has since passed into Dene legend, and it's said that following that night, their warriors dared not venture into the hills anymore lest they be taken by whatever made the Naha disappear. Hundreds of years later, the promise of gold prompted the arrival of European settlers in the area, but as the trickle of migrants became a torrent of prospectors, some of their numbers seemed to vanish into thin air. Perhaps the most famous tale is from the year of 1905 and details two brothers named Frank and Willie MacLeod. Frank and Willie traipsed through a brutal northwestern winter until they reached a place known as Gold Creek, and after a few weeks of panning and searching, they were rewarded with a sizable amount of gold. The following spring, the brothers returned to Nahanni to collect more gold, only this time, they were accompanied by a small team of fellow prospectors. The weather was more favorable, they were in a larger group, and each man was more than capable of surviving the frigid tundra. Yet not a single one of them were ever seen again. 3 years later, the MacLeod's younger brother led a team up into the mountains, intent on uncovering the fate of his older siblings. Their only discovery were 2 skeletons at a creekside camp down in the valley. Both victims appeared to have their heads torn off. From that day forth, the valley had become known as Dead Men's Valley, while the creek has earned the rather uncreative nickname of Headless Creek. Yet it wasn't just the unfortunate MacLeod brothers who mysteriously lost their lives in the park during the early 20th century. At the behest of a large mining corporation, a Scottish mining engineer had visited Nahanni shortly after the MacLeods went missing. His goal was to survey a potential mining site and was being paid handsomely for his work, but for some reason, the engineer failed to return in order to collect his pay. A search party was sent into Nahanni in order to bring the engineer home alive, but not a single trace of him could be found. Then, when the search party returned, they brought with them a chilling story indeed. In order to aid their navigation of Nahanni's hills and valleys, the search party had enlisted the help of some guides from the Dene tribe. But when the search team asked their guides to take them up into mountains the engineer had been tasked with surveying, the tribesmen flat out refused. Later reports suggested that the tribesmen were terrified at the prospect of going up into the mountains, especially after sundown, and threatened to abandon their guests should they attempt to climb them. But when asked what exactly scared them so much, the tribesmen seemed unable or unwilling to explain. Over a decade later, in 1917, a Yukon-based prospector by the name of Martin Jorgensen wandered into the hills around Nahanni. He'd heard of many other gold hunters striking it rich in the area, and having exhausted all options in his native territory, he packed up and moved out into the hills in search of his fortune. A few months later, Martin apparently wrote to his family, informing them that he had stumbled across the biggest gold vein he'd ever seen, and promised them that they'd soon be some of the wealthiest people in all of Yukon. The letter was the last Martin's family had ever heard from him. Another search party was sent into the hills, only this one found the man that they were looking for. Martin was found leaning up against the smoldering wreck of the cabin he'd been renting, his head having been torn clean off. Some have suggested Martin's murder was perpetrated by those envious of his gold discovery, and that the number one suspects should have been whoever came in possession of his gold claim. Yet shortly after he was murdered, local newspaper reports began to circulate claiming that the beheading incidents were related to so-called headhunters. It's not clear if the term headhunters is a reference to bounty hunters, contract killers, or was merely a nod to the gruesome nature of the crime, but the phrasing certainly frightened those who read the article. Having firmly established a reputation as being a perilous place to explore, visits to the Nahanni National Park dropped off following the initial gold rush. Over time, it became an obscure wilderness that few people cared or dared to visit, and by the 1940s, the legends of Nahanni were in danger of being forgotten. But by 1946, Canadian mining companies had begun to cast a greedy eye over the relatively untouched Mackenzie Mountains, a portion of which are a protected area of the park. One company tasked a Calgary-based mining expert named Frank M.W. Henderson with surveying several potential mining sites. So, accompanied by his longtime partner Jack Patterson, Frank plotted a course between the sites, then hiked up into the hills to begin his work. One day, Henderson and Patterson decided to split up in order to cover more ground, but agreed to meet at a spot near Virginia Falls when the workday was over. They agreed that the first man to arrive would carve a small symbol into a large, distinctive-looking tree. That way, the other would know that they had finished their work and had headed back to camp. When the workday was over, Frank Henderson was the first to arrive at the tree, so he carved the agreed-upon symbol and wandered back to camp to await the arrival of his partner. Yet as the hours went by and Jack failed to return to camp, Frank became increasingly worried for his friend and colleague. As night fell, and Jack had still not returned to camp, Frank knew that something must have happened to his partner to cause him to be so late. Then at sunrise, when Jack's tent was still empty, Frank hiked off into the woods in search of his missing friend. The search barely lasted an hour. As Frank walked, he began to feel an increasing sense of disorientation, as once familiar patches of forest started to feel almost alien to him. Before long, he was so overcome with fright that he rushed back to his campsite, packed his things, then fled the area with Jack still missing. Several weeks later, he returned to the Nahanni National Park to search for his missing colleague, but like so many others who'd gone before him, there was no trace of Jack Patterson to be found. But even on that second visit, with a veritable platoon of men in tow, Frank still felt that same inexplicable terror creeping upon him. That night, Frank and the search team were awoken by a group of First Nations men who rode into camp and warned of something terrifying. The men claimed that they had spotted pale, ghostly shapes moving along the valley below, and that the search party should join them in fleeing the area. Naturally, Frank and the team obliged the young men, packed up their things, then hiked out of Nahanni, never to return. To use Frank's own words, there is absolutely no denying the sinister atmosphere of that whole valley. The weird, continual wailing of the wind is something I won't soon forget. Over the years that have followed, there have been countless other reports of similar deaths and disappearances occurring in the Nahanni National Park. It should also be noted that plane crashes are so common among a section of the Mackenzie Mountains that the area has earned the nickname Funeral Range. So, why are such mysterious and terrifying events so common in Nahanni National Park? Aside from the fact that the place consists of such unforgiving terrain, Nahanni is home to some of the most deadly and active predators in the world. Nahanni is a wilderness in the very sense of the word, and food is scarce for all those that wander its hills. A hungry bear or wildcat would have no issue with stalking and killing a human, and that might well account for some of the disappearances. But perhaps there's some other reason why people keep dying and disappearing from Nahanni National Park. Maybe it has something to do with the disappearance of the Naha tribe all those years ago, and to solve one case would answer a 1,000-year-old question. But maybe the answer to that question is far too terrifying for us to possibly comprehend. During the summer of 2015, 22-year-old Morgan Heimer was working as a commercial guide for Tour West, a Wyoming-based rafting company that organized trips all over the country. The Cody native was on summer break from studying English at the University of Wyoming and was putting his skills and passion as an outdoorsman to use in order to save for some beer money. Morgan was a popular and competent employee, and his talent for being a river guide was evident from the get-go. Within just a few weeks, he had become a trusted part of Tour West's team and was chosen to accompany a group of clients to the Grand Canyon National Park in northern Arizona. It was Morgan's dream come true. He was actually being paid to indulge in his passions, so naturally he was very excited over the upcoming rafting trip. Little did he know, it was a trip that he would never return from. June 2nd of 2015 marked the 6th of 8 days rafting down the Colorado River, and it had been smooth sailing thus far. Yet around 4 p.m. that day, as the team rested on a cliffside near a geothermal hot spring named Pumpkin Springs, Morgan approached the lead guide and asked to talk to him in private. Then, as they strolled out of earshot, Morgan asked permission to take some time off that afternoon. Since they were still in the middle of a rafting trip, there wasn't exactly much for Morgan to see or do in that area, and even though he seemed sound in mind and body, the lead guide asked Morgan if everything was okay. Morgan replied that he was fine, but before the lead guide could get to the bottom of the issue, they were called away at the request of one of their clients. After telling Morgan that they'd continue the talk after seeing to their clients, the lead guide started making his way back towards the group. He was expecting the young college student to follow him, but when he turned around, Morgan was gone. The lead guide later said that he believed that Morgan had simply gotten frustrated and had wandered off on his own with every intention of returning. The reality was very different, as Morgan Heimer was never seen again. The lead guide and a handful of the company's clients mounted a brief preliminary search for Morgan, calling out his name wherever they went, but not a single trace of Morgan could be found. So at exactly 7:26 p.m., the lead guide contacted both police and park rangers to report Morgan missing. The following morning, a large group of search and rescue personnel traveled over to the Grand Canyon National Park to begin searching for the missing student. At first, the group was hopeful. Morgan's physical fitness and his knowledge of the outdoors meant that he had a better chance than most at surviving the wilderness. But after 48 hours of Morgan's continued absence, they began to fear the worst. The general consensus among the search and rescue teams was that Morgan had suffered some kind of fatal accident. Some suspected he tripped or stumbled while walking near the edge of a cliff, but after sweeping the surrounding areas, Morgan's body was nowhere to be found. Rescue personnel then considered the possibility that Morgan had fallen into the river and drowned. Yet despite an extensive search of the lower portions of the Colorado River, no human corpses were discovered. It seems bizarre that Morgan couldn't be found after wandering off from the group, as he was wearing brightly colored clothes and carried a purple water bottle. It seems bizarre that Morgan couldn't be found after wandering off from the group, as he was wearing brightly colored clothes and carried a purple water bottle. It wasn't like his body would be difficult to spot if he'd fallen down a cliff, and it was only so far that he could float downstream before ending up in a lake somewhere. This was also assuming that Morgan had suffered some kind of head trauma before falling into the water, as by all accounts, he was physically strong and a confident swimmer. It's an extremely rare event that people disappear without a trace while visiting one of our nation's national parks, but chillingly, that's exactly what appears to have happened to Morgan. Even after the initial 6-day search was called off, park rangers continued to patrol the river between river miles 211 and 225, and mounted almost continual foot patrols around Pumpkin Springs. Rangers and volunteers scoured the area for months, but once again, not a single thing was found. It was as if Morgan had simply dropped off the face of the earth. Most agree that the most likely explanation lies somewhere in the region of tragic accident, and that the Colorado River played a major part in ensuring Morgan's body would never be found. But even all these years later, neither his remains nor his belongings have ever been recovered, and this pushes us to consider other, less conventional means of explanation. Morgan isn't the only person to suddenly and inexplicably go missing while touring a U.S. national park, but like we've already touched on, he's been unlucky enough to be part of a small group whose bodies have never been recovered. Although many like to suggest that the park's wildlife would quickly and savagely dispose of any human remains, scavengers are unlikely to consume a maroon baseball cap or a purple water bottle, both of which were in Morgan's possession at the time of his disappearance. So, if Morgan's remains aren't lying at the bottom of the Colorado River, and they weren't recovered from the surrounding national park, where exactly did he go? It's not out of the realm of possibility that Morgan Heimer simply walked to the nearest highway, hitched a ride to the Mexican border, and started a new life for himself south of the border. But if that is what happened, he's yet to contact a heartbroken family who have publicly pleaded with him to get in touch on several different occasions. Beyond this, the only explanations are as preternatural as they are terrifying. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. During the summer of 1975, a 21-year-old from New Hampshire by the name of Deborah Carrick decided to embark on the trip of a lifetime. A friend in California had invited Deborah to their wedding, but instead of simply traveling to and fro via bus or train, Deborah decided to turn the journey into the mother of all road trips. Before arriving in California a few days before her friend's wedding, Deborah planned to stop at every single national park between her and her destination on a mammoth tour of some of the world's largest nature preserves. So on August 2nd, Deborah bid farewell to her parents and boyfriend, then boarded a bus which drove off into the sunset. On August 4th of 1975, Deborah had made it all the way to Rapid City, South Dakota, and after disembarking the bus, she hitched up to Mount Rushmore in the Wind Cave National Park. A few days later, Deborah was wandering through Yellowstone when she came across a group of similarly aged hikers. Having a great deal in common, she and the hikers became fast friends, and after joining them on the remainder of their hike, Deborah told them the story of her cross-country adventure. The group were enthralled as they were impressed, and one of the girls among them offered Deborah a place to stay if she was ever in the neighborhood of Idaho Falls. We know that Deborah took the girl up on her offer, but later parted with them before continuing her hitchhike south. Following her encounter with the Yellowstone hikers, Deborah would go on to meet a man named Vern sometime between August 9th and 16th. Vern became her new traveling partner for a while, and it's been speculated that the pair were romantically involved, but what we know for certain is that they visited a variety of different parks together. After hiking through Grand Teton National Park, The pair traveled over to Glacier, then looped back through Yellowstone before hitchhiking down to Denver, Colorado on August 16th. That same day, Deborah made a note in her journal which simply read, Denver, Colorado, left V. Assuming that V stands for Vern, the curtness of the entry suggests that it could have been written in anger, and that perhaps Deborah couldn't bring herself to write Vern's name. Some might purport that it was Deborah's journaling style, or that the lack of detail reflects a non-event. But if parting with Vern was so insignificant, why even mention it at all? Sometime after she wrote the journal entry, Deborah called her 14-year-old sister back in New Hampshire using a payphone next to a Greyhound bus station. After some brief small talk, Deborah told her sister that she had been traveling around with someone she referred to as Cowboy, but had just parted company with him. This is most likely a reference to Vern and constitutes another instance where Deborah was unable to say his name. Deborah then told her sister that she would be traveling down to the Grand Canyon in a rented van with 3 French girls that she'd met in Denver, and that she'd call again in a few days in order to talk with her mother and father. However, there is no record of Deborah renting any kind of vehicle in the state of Colorado, and there is no evidence that she ever met 3 French girls while staying in Denver. If she did, she certainly didn't check into Flagstaff's Flamingo Hotel with them on August 17th, as the hotel's staff later stated that Deborah was definitely traveling alone. The hotel's owners recalled that Deborah had paid with 2 travelers' checks for a $12 room, and how she'd mentioned a possible trip to the Grand Canyon the following day. The next morning, hotel staff witnessed Deborah leaving the hotel looking happy and healthy, dead set on visiting the Grand Canyon. We can't be sure if Deborah ever did visit the Grand Canyon that day, but we can be certain of the fact that she never returned to her hotel. In fact, following that morning's sighting by the staff of the Flamingo Hotel, Deborah Carrick was never seen again. After failing to contact them for several days, Deborah's family reported her missing to state police in both Arizona and California. This prompted several police agencies to begin an intensive search of the region's highways and byways, but what they found was deeply disturbing. On August 26th, a handful of Deborah's belongings were found discarded on a stretch of California highway about 30 miles west of her final destination, Sebastopol. The significance of the location was chilling, as the bodies of 4 murdered were found in the area right around the time of Deborah's disappearance. This has led many to believe that Deborah became the victim of an active serial killer. Yet, if there was a serial murderer on the loose, he certainly hasn't been identified. All 4 cases connected to the women's corpses remain unsolved, and they're unlikely to be closed anytime soon. Following the discovery of her belongings, 4 of Deborah's traveler's checks would be cashed at a California bank on September 2nd. Witnesses later stated that the person who cashed them was male, while the bank tellers were completely unaware that the signature used was fraudulent. The next day, more checks were cashed at a bank in Albuquerque, New Mexico, suggesting whoever had taken them from her was fleeing the region in which she'd gone missing. The development bore grim tidings for the Carrick family, and they continued to wait in terror for the news that no parent wants to hear. Then one day, it came. On September 9th, 2 police officers arrived at the Carrick family home to pass on some heartbreaking news. Their daughter was dead. Her lifeless body had been discovered in a side canyon of the Little Colorado River, just off of Highway 64. It appeared that she had been dead for around 3 weeks, and that the cause of death was severe blunt force trauma to her skull. In short, Deborah had been murdered. What the police left out of their solemn report was that the wounds to Deborah's head and neck were so bad that she could only be identified through her dental records. She had been partially stripped, but investigators were unable to determine if she had been violated prior to her death. It was a devastating discovery, and given how she had been traveling cross-country while mostly alone, the police were faced with a huge task in finding the person who'd taken Deborah's life. But there was one name that kept finding its way onto their meager list of suspects, that of William F. Samusdell. Samistill was a tow truck driver living in Mojave County at the time of Deborah's death. He had also been convicted of 4 other homicides involving young women, but was somehow out of prison and living in the area at the time of Deborah's murder. Court documents state that during one of Samistill's murders, he had ordered a victim to strip before the assault commenced, but was also careful to redress her once it was over. This led many of the investigation team to believe that Deborah had been a victim of Samistill, and that her unusual state of dress was in line with his modus operandi. However, due to Deborah's corpse being in an advanced stage of decomposition, it was impossible to determine if any such violation had taken place. Samistill was later convicted of the murder of 2 hitchhikers from Las Vegas, as in 1978, he had bludgeoned 2 siblings named Jacqueline and Malcolm Bradshaw after picking them up at a gas station in Barstow. He was also guilty of murdering the 22-year-old daughter of an Arizona-based FBI agent who was on her way to pick up her husband from Tucson Airport. Her body was later discovered near Fort Huachuca, and it was determined that she too had been violated prior to her death. His 2 other murders occurred in similar ways, and each time, Samistill used a blunt object to dispatch his victim after ordering them to redress. This obviously made him the case's prime suspect for a long time, and given that he's still alive in a Wisconsin prison, there's still hope that he might still go to trial. And even as imminent as it seems, the reality is that seeing William Samistill convicted of Deborah's murder in the foreseeable future is highly unlikely. Deborah's murder is now 47 years old, and the number of reliable witnesses has diminished dramatically. Her parents have now passed, and only her little sister is left to search for answers. But sadly, unless any new witnesses come forward, or law enforcement recover a previously unknown DNA sample, Deborah's is a case that is increasingly unlikely to be closed. On the morning of July 24th, 2019, 32-year-old Jordan Murray walked into a convenience store in his small hometown of Cwmbach in Wales. Jordan was a soft-spoken, introverted man with a passion for the great outdoors, and he took full advantage of the nearby Brecon Beacons National Park with regular hikes and runs. By all accounts, Cwmbach is a safe, quiet, and pleasant place to live, but that summer, the village's serenity was shattered when a small-town police inquiry became a national media story. Because after purchasing a bottle of water at exactly 11:26 a.m., Jordan walked out of the convenience store and simply vanished. Since Jordan was such a frequent camper, with some of his trips lasting a week or so at a time, his absence didn't alarm his parents until at least 8 days after he disappeared. By the 8th day, his parents had noticed that several of their texts to Jordan had remained unanswered. This was unusual, as Jordan not only conserved his phone battery during his trips, but often carried a small portable charger with him to ensure that he could contact emergency services in the event of an accident. After failing to return their calls for 8 full days, Jordan's parents drove over to his apartment to perform a welfare check. They gained access to his building, found his room, then noticed something extremely concerning. The front door of their son's apartment was wide open. When they walked inside, John's parents discovered that his PlayStation was still switched on and that his mobile phone was plugged into its charger. It was as if he'd intended to leave his apartment for a few minutes, then suddenly decided to never return. Following the arrival of 2 South Wales police officers, Jordan's parents helped them sort through their son's belongings in an attempt to determine if anything was missing. And this is how the police discovered that a black rucksack, a camping burner, a headlamp, and a pair of black trainers were all missing from Jordan's apartment. This changed the narrative slightly. Jordan had indeed fled his apartment suddenly, but it had been with a kind of bug-out bag, along with a headlamp to help him see at night. Police determined that there were no signs of any struggle, and a DNA analysis of the property showed that only Jordan's was present at the scene. So, what had prompted him to flee his lodging so quickly. Law enforcement began to canvass Jordan's neighborhood, but none of them seemed to know anything regarding his sudden disappearance, and with a lack of any other information, the police began to theorize that Jordan had suffered an accident after heading out on an impromptu camping trip. With that in mind, search and rescue teams were called in to scour the surrounding areas, with a particular focus on the Brecon Beacons, since Jordan had been known to frequently visit the area. An extensive array of search and rescue assets were deployed to aid the search, including thermal imaging drones, tracker dogs, and night vision equipment. But unfortunately, strong winds and torrential rain hindered the team's attempts to mount an effective search. With steep hillsides turning to mud, the terrain became too dangerous to traverse, and efforts were consequently postponed. However, the lead search officer was steadfast in his belief that Jordan was not living rough in the area because he probably would have taken his phone, wallet, and a wider range of camping equipment. The search recommenced as soon as possible, but even after extensive patrols of the surrounding countryside, no trace of Jordan could be found. A whole year went by and Jordan remained a missing person. Yet in January of 2021, the investigation was reinvigorated after a possible sighting was reported 120 miles away from Coombach, in a West Midlands town named Stratford-upon-Avon. A person claimed that back in September of 2020, he had spoken to a man in Stratford who had been living rough. In their conversation, this man stated that he was living off the grid, that he was homeless, and interestingly, that he used to live in Wales. It was only months later, after seeing an online post that detailed Jordan's disappearance, that he realized that he'd been speaking to the missing person. Jordan's family has since made regular trips to the area in order to search for him, but so far, they'd had no luck. There are two prominent theories regarding what may have happened to Jordan on that day. Perhaps the most reasonable of the two is that Jordan simply chose to go on a hike and suffered some sort of accident. This theory is even more likely when you consider that Jordan had made no contact since he disappeared and has not used his bank account. However, the scene at Jordan's flat is odd to say the least. If Jordan had decided to head out for a camping trip, why would he leave his phone behind, the PlayStation running, and his front door wide open? This raises the question of, could Jordan have sought to disappear and start a new life elsewhere? The reported sighting in Stratford would support this, but if this were the case, why did he decide to leave his wallet and cash behind? Money that would be useful in kickstarting a new life. It also seems very unlikely that Jordan would neglect to contact his family in any way. This forces us to consider the idea that Jordan was either murdered or that he had taken his own life, but there is very little evidence to support either of these ideas. The police found no sign of intrusion at the flat, nor any forensic evidence to suggest that there had been any kind of assault. There was also nothing to suggest that Jordan was depressed prior to his disappearance, and that he had any idea of taking his own life either. In conclusion, it seems more than likely that Jordan met his fate on the nearby Brecon Beacons. But if that is the case, why have search and rescue teams been unable to recover his body? The Brecon Beacons are vast, but they still constitute a limited area and are nowhere near as large as national parks over in the US. They also lack the forest cover that might hide Jordan's tracks or potential campsites, meaning that locating him by air should have been a relatively easy feat. So, if Jordan really did just disappear, what was the cause? Perhaps like so many other cases of people going missing in national parks, science just isn't quite ready to explain what has happened or where he's gone, and the truth of Jordan's disappearance may have terrifying implications for our collective reality. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Wednesday and Friday at 7 p.m. EST. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, peace out, Brussels sprout.